Hi everybody, this is Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com, and today I'm going to be going over a hand from a 100NL game. So let's get right to it. In this hand I'm in the cutoff. There are two folds before me. Obviously with the queens I make an open and I choose a pot size bet with my strong holding. There are two folds from the button and the small blind, and now the big blind decides to raise it up to $12.50, which is slightly more than a pot-sized raise. A pot-sized raise would be $11, but he's gone slightly higher to $12.50, presumably because he wants to make the price more favourable to him if he's got to play the rest of the hand out of position. Now, fairly clearly I have two choices here. I can either call and see a flop, or I can raise. If I raise, obviously I have to decide what to do if he shoves over my raise. Now at this point I decided to bring up this player's HUD stats during the this is what I did in play during the game, because I wanted to know kind of what kind of a player he was, whether he was very aggressive or whatever. And so I brought up this screen, and you can see here that there is a stat here which is 4-bet after raising, which he does 7% of the time, or at least he does on the sample of play that I have for him. But I've got a fairly decent sample size on this player. And this is a stat which shows what he does after he opens the betting. Somebody 3-bets and then he 4-bets. Now that stat is obviously shows that he's fairly conservative in that respect. Now here I've obviously opened, he's 3-bet, and what I wanted to try and understand is that if I 4-bet, how likely is he to shove, and what kind of range would he be shoving with there? Now, since this information would lead me to believe that if I were to 4-bet him here and he shoved on me, he would have a very, very tight range, I was happy to take a line of 4-betting, as I do here, raising to 30, and then when he shoved I decided to fold, which was my plan, having made the 4-bet previously. Now, one thing I want to add here is that my 4-bet sizing is quite important, because I made the raise to 30, which is not a pot-sized raise. After he raised to $12.50, a pot-sized raise would have raised to about 38. But I decided to go to 30 for a very specific reason, and the reason is that this is exactly, well, not exactly, but very close to 1/4 of my stack, so that I knew that if he shoved over this raise, I would need to basically win 3 times in 8 if I called off to break even, which means I'd need 37.5% against his range. Now, as I mentioned, I knew that if he shoved over me here, I'd need 38% in order to be able to call. Now, if I bring in Equilab here, we can look at what the situation is. I've given myself the hand a pair of queens, as you can see here, and I've given the villain the range of quite a tight range for his play of queens plus and ace king suited and ace king off. Now, if we run the evaluation, you'll see that it tells me that I need 40% in order to call off successfully here, but I think I've given him the absolute widest range he could possibly have for this play, bearing in mind what we saw when we looked at his HUD stats earlier. In fact, I think it's possible that he doesn't even have ace king off, or maybe even ace king suited in this range. And if I take ace king off out of his range, you'll see that now I've only got 28%, which is way below the 37.5% that I need in order to call off successfully against his shove. Now, I'm quite happy with the way I played this hand, because I think that when I make the 4-bet and then I fold to his shove, I'm probably getting away from the hand fairly cheaply if I'm assuming that aces and kings are a huge part of the range which he's using to make this play, and as we saw when we looked at his HUD stats earlier, that seems to be quite likely. If I just call in this situation, then if the flop comes low, it's going to be very hard for me to get away from the hand, and I may end up getting stacked when, as I've played it, I've got away with just losing 1/4 of my stack. So I'm quite happy with the way I played it. But if we bring Poker Snowy up, Poker Snowy has a different opinion altogether. So I've keyed the hand into Poker Snowy here, and as you can see, we'll play through it. And I open to 3.5, and then the guy raises. Obviously, we don't know what the guy's raise, what the guy has here. But when I raise to 30, Poker Snowy offers this opinion that I've opened myself up to an unpleasant re-raise. You can see all this down here. It offers a little tip, and thinks that I should just call. And if you look at the evaluation down here, it has this as quite a bad mistake. But as I identified in the previous explanation, I made this play for a very specific reason, because I felt that I could narrow down the villain's range of hands quite substantially. Now, continuing with how Poker Snowy looks at this, after this guy shoves on me and I fold, again, Poker Snowy doesn't like this at all and thinks this is a really bad mistake, pitching it at 5.73 big blinds in terms of how much of an error it is. Now, my suspicion here is that Snowy, which is obviously trying to play a GTO style for all players at the table, is perhaps assigning much wider ranges than I have to player 3, and also player 3's perception of my range. Because as we know, from what I know about the villain here, I've narrowed down the range considerably and probably am assigning this villain a much tighter range than Snowy is, and that may be why Snowy doesn't like my play. Okay, this has been Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com.
So the first thing worth mentioning is you said that the opponent is 3-betting a little bit larger out of position to, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but something to the effect of give himself a better price or something like that. Really what he's doing is he's trying to increase his pre-flop fold equity so that you fold more often, because when he is out of position, he doesn't mind if you fold more often. And also, he's trying to make the stack to pot ratio shallower, because as stacks get deeper after the flop, that favors the person in position. So in theory, you want to make the stacks shallow if you're going to be out of position, so that the person in position doesn't have a positional advantage or a minimal positional advantage. All right, next thing worth mentioning is you raise to 3.5. This guy makes it 12.50. So you really got after it looking at his heads-up display, which I think is a good thing. The problem is I think we only have 386 hands. Maybe I'm wrong about where the hand number is located. Maybe the hand's not even on here. I'm not entirely sure. But 386 hands I do not think is enough to accurately pinpoint 3-betting and especially 4-betting stats. And in order for you to fold this hand, as you eventually do, I think you need to be very, very, very confident that this guy never has something like jacks, or as Poker Snowy is probably going to assume, ace-5 suited. So let's assume the guy has aces, kings, and queens, right? This is like your worst case scenario. In that scenario, you have 20% equity and you clearly should fold, right? But that's queens plus, right? Let's just give the guy ace-king offsuit. As you see now, we are all of a sudden, actually we can give ace-king suited as well, clearly. As you can see now, we are getting a price where we can't fold. So this is, I think, almost always the absolute norm. It's hard for anyone to be much tighter than this. So if it's hard to be much tighter than this, well, then we kind of have to call, because this is almost like the worst case scenario. So if a best case scenario is, let's add jacks, like just add jacks, right? If we only add jacks, now you can see we're all the way up to 47%. If we add a hand like tens or ace-queen suited, it's going to just make us better and better. And to fold out a hand where we need to win, whatever it was, you said 3 out of 8, that's going to be a spot where we just have to call, is what it amounts to, because we're getting such a good price. The only time folding is good is when his range is pocket queens, pocket kings, and pocket aces. And that's just really, really hard, in my mind at least, given we don't have a ton of hands on the player. And really, we don't have a ton of hands on the player. So going to the Poker Snowy analysis, let's just skip forward a little bit. Right here, it suggests that you just call preflop. And perhaps the reason for that is because it knows that if you 4-bet and get jammed on, you are going to be in a tough spot. For that reason, I think if you are going to 4-bet, you probably want to 4-bet on the tiny side. And I know you went small, $30, right, which is pretty small. I think you could actually go something like 25, because then that's going to induce your opponent to call with a lot of stuff from out of position. Whereas when you make it 30, I don't really know what you're inducing, because you're giving him like an okay price to where calling makes some sense. But at the same time, if he can jam and make you fold ever, it's going to be a huge success for him. So I certainly don't mind re-raising. And if I was you, what I would do is I would play around with these various pot size buttons on Poker Snowy. I mean, click 0.35 pot and see what it says, and click half pot and see what it says. I think that, I don't know what it would say in these spots, but it's certainly going to be insightful, right? And very often you'll see that sometimes it says a big bet is particularly bad, but a small bet is good, or at least reasonable. Here, though, it definitely suggests call, which is kind of interesting if your options were to make a 0.69 pot size raise like you did, or to call. So, I mean, it gives you the explanation, and it's true. This is one of these spots where if you 3-bet hands like 4-bet hands like ace king or queens or jacks, and you get jammed on, you're never really loving it. So for that reason, maybe you should just be calling. However, if you're only 4-betting aces and kings and then a few bluffs, you're really not 4-betting very often at all. So maybe Poker Snowy does not suggest 4-betting much at all at this point. I mean, if it's saying don't do queens because queens is close to too weak to do for value, well then clearly you're just not 4-betting very often. So I would have 4-bet here. I would have gone smaller though, and I still would have called it off. So it takes a lot for me to be very confident in pre-flop, well, reads in general, but especially reads that take a lot of hands to get relevant statistics on. And again, I don't really know your player. I would have really loved to see him just like never get it all in with anything besides aces and kings. And some players will only get it all in with aces and kings. And if that's the case, I'm fine with the re-raise with the intention of folding because you get very accurate information. And also you get him to call with a lot of hands that you dominate. Because it's fine to 4-bet with a hand like jacks or tens or ace king if you know you're only getting jammed on by aces and kings, because when your opponent calls, he's going to be really, really dominated. And when he jams, you are really, really dominated. But in order to make a fold in this at this spot, you have to essentially say that I am really, really confident in my reads. And if I've learned one thing from playing a lot of poker, it is that especially online, when you don't have a ton of hands on a player, you don't actually know who the player is and you've played with them a ton, your reads are just not nearly as spot on as you would think they are. So I would have re-raised here and gotten it all in and been happy about it. And, clearly Poker Snowy says that folding is much worse than calling. For it to say it's this big of a difference, it's probably assuming the opponent's shoving something like these hands, and then maybe even something like ace-5 suited and ace-4 suited thrown in there to where you have a pretty substantial edge. So I would not have folded at this point as played. It's great when you make a good fold, but whenever the guy has jacks or ace-king or ace-queen, it's just an absolute disaster. And in spots like this, what I try to look at is what is the worst-case scenario? Worst-case scenario is exactly aces and kings. And at that point, we're only going to win 20% of the time. And you need to win 37% of the time, I believe you said. And that's the absolute worst case. And that only happens when he has those few hands. But whenever he does have the slightly wider range of just queens and ace-king, which I think is perfectly reasonable from out of position, to jam those hands because you want to, again, minimize your post-flop disadvantage. Because imagine he's sitting here with ace-king. He doesn't really want to call because if he calls and gets a flop that's unfavorable, any non-ace or king flop, he's just check folding a lot of the time. Or he's check calling, and then he is going to end up playing quite poorly on the later streets. So by shoving ace-king, it makes it to where shoving can't be that bad. If it is bad, it's probably just good. And same thing goes for hands like jacks. I mean, whenever you shove with the jacks, you're not loving it, but you pick up a lot of equity immediately, and also you can't get outplayed. Again, same thing with jacks. Like, say he is against a hand like, well, say you're getting after it with ace-5 suited, and he has jacks, and the flop comes king-queen-3 or king-7-3. He's check calling once, and then he's going to end up folding a lot of the time if you just keep barreling. So from out of position, especially, he's really incentivized to not call your 4-bet. He's more incentivized to shove or fold. If he was in position, he's going to make better decisions. So in that spot, when he decides to put it all in, I would be slightly more inclined to fold because then he's incentivized to call, right? So if he's incentivized to call, that should lead you to be more afraid when he shoves because either he's going to be way more polarized. But even then with a hand like 9-7 suited in position, it's probably fine just to see a flop, and ace-5 suited in position is fine to see a flop. But here, if he has those hands that he did 3-bet, he almost certainly is just going to fold, right? So anyway, interesting spot. I think your hand's just too good to fold. That's really what it amounts to. I'm basically never folding queens in spots like this. And if you're against someone who you think they're going to 4-bet you sometimes and you don't know how to play against the 4-bet, I would just call the initial 3-bet and see a flop. So fun hand. Thanks for sharing it. This has been Jonathan Little for dnbpoker.com.